is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. A former European commissioner went on television recently and sounded delighted that the Romanian government had just annulled an entire election.
Vice President J.D. Vance's reprimand for Europe came in the middle of the crisis surrounding Romania's presidential election, which lasted from November 2024 to May 2025. A crisis that involved a political campaign boosted by TikTok, allegations of Russian interference, and the collapse of the government. But now that the dust has settled, Romania again has a pro-European, anti-Russian president and government. So we're asking, is their crisis over? Has Romania weathered the storm? The first round of the November 2024 presidential election brought an unexpected result. A relative unknown, Călin Georgescu, won, taking 23% of the vote. In the final weeks before the election, his recognizability had surged, particularly online. But the problem wasn't that he was unknown. The problem was with his message.
He used to speak quite positively about Vladimir Putin, whom he considered effective leader defending interests of his own country. He was highly anti-Western, anti-EU. At some point, at least during the campaign in November, he was also skeptical when it comes to cooperation with NATO and with United States, particularly pre-Donald Trump United States.
Besides his political standpoints, Georgescu also held some other unorthodox views.
He was perpetuating and promoting different kind of conspiracy theories. Some were very bizarre, some less bizarre. So he was talking about this moon landing scam. Another one was that there's some conspiracy and among great corporations which are producing mineral water, and the fact that they are putting this water in the plastic bottles is meant to actually kill the memory of water.
And Georgescu's message also harked back to Romania's communist past.
He wasn't praising communism per se, but he was trying to obviously appeal to the older part of the electorate, to the older generation, bringing up this idea of good old times where people were actually in contact with their neighbors, knew their neighbors, and so on and so forth.
Georgescu paired this approach with appeals to defend Romania's religiosity and identity from the globalists currently in power. And he won the first round of the election. His result, though, came as a huge surprise, and it roused suspicions. Had there been irregularities? Given Georgescu's pro-Putin sympathies, maybe there was Russian interference, or perhaps his huge popularity on TikTok suggested that China had been involved too. The media looked into Georgescu's links to local and external groups involved in the campaign, and an investigation from the secret services was made public.
After a couple of days, President of Romania, back then it was Klaus Werner Iohannis, decided to actually disclose documents and reports he got from 4 different public institutions, including 2 branches of intelligence. Documents which were then presented by Romanian media as proof that Georgescu was supported from outside, probably from Russia, that his campaign was organized and financed by organizations linked by Russia. The problem is that even though public media and Romanian politicians were claiming that case is basically closed because, according to Secret Service documents, Russia was involved in the electoral process, those documents were not really pointing that fact straightforward. In fact, the word Russia only appears in those documents in 2 contexts. Once when one of the documents suggests that similar methods were used by Russia in Ukraine, which is true, but on the other hand, well, this kind of PR campaign, or we can call it manipulation of algorithm, is quite popular, and basically every company specializing in conducting this kind of PR campaigns, and in particular electoral campaigns, but also marketing campaigns. They're using the same method, so it's not typical only for Russians. Investigative journalists and secret services were still trying to find some links between him and Russia. They managed to find some interesting connections of Georgescu with, among other, Horatiu Potra, that's a mercenary who used to fight for many years in Africa. Apparently, he was fighting exactly in the same places where infamous Wagner group was fighting, which some media in Romania and some politicians consider to be proof that there are links between Russian private military, of course linked to the Kremlin, with Horatiu Potra. Horatiu Potra, who was not only simply cooperating and working for Georgescu, but who was his personal bodyguard and responsible for his security detail. It sparked a lot of controversy because, as I said, statement that elections were basically forged or heavily influenced by Russia was not really properly proven, neither back then nor today.
But with financing, there is no doubt there were irregularities.
Călin Georgescu claimed in the end of his campaign and after first round of re-election that he spent literally 0 Romanian lei for his political campaign. And that was obviously not true. I mean, if you see how intense his social media campaign was, and if you see that there were also some physical promotional materials distributed or simply hanging somewhere around Romania, you can come to the conclusion that, okay, maybe it wasn't really costly in comparison particularly to money spent by regular candidates. I'm talking about mainstream candidates, of course. But definitely some money was spent.
But there was proof enough for the Constitutional Court to annul the elections on the 6th of December 2024. This decision led to unexpected consequences.
Anyway, it was quite obvious that Georgescu will decide to run again in those repeated elections, particularly given the fact that the cancellation of 2024 election actually gave him additional boost. He wasn't really too popular. Yes, he managed to get 23% of votes, but that was because of his TikTok activity. But after he became a star of a huge electoral scandal, he actually became very, very popular nationwide. What's more, a lot of people started considering him as a kind of a hero of the anti-mainstream opposition, even if part of electorate wasn't really supporting his claims regarding Russia, NATO, or really even agreeing with him on his main points. They were declaring during opinion poll surveys that they may support him just to show that they want to get rid of the old political elite.
Since the 1990s, Romania has been ruled by the same group of politicians, which are grouped in 2 camps: the Social Democratic Party, post-communists, and the centre-right camp, whose largest party is the National Liberal Party. In formal terms, they're ideologically opposed, but they have cooperated to form a government. The last time was in 2021, and the current government comprises the post-communists and the centre-right, including the National Liberals.
Significant part of Romanian population simply believes that their political scene is kind of walled in, and that this situation shouldn't last because, well, there are many corruption scandals which happened during the last 30 years. With involvement of the current political class, and a lot of people actually want some change. They want some new, fresh air being introduced into this political scene, and that's why it gave additional boost to Călin Georgescu, particularly after cancellation of elections in 2024.
It became clear that Georgescu would want to run again, but would he be allowed? His supporters were hopeful after Vance gave his speech in Munich, feeling that US pressure could come to bear against the Romanian elite. This was not ultimately the case. Georgescu applied, but was rejected. The Constitutional Court justified the decision by claiming that it had already been proven that he didn't meet Romania's constitutional values. Georgescu's absence created the conditions for another right-wing, Eurosceptic candidate to return to the limelight.
George Simion, before the first round of annual elections, was actually considered by many to be one of the frontrunners of the elections. His popularity was rising. Everybody expected that he will get to the second round of those elections, where he will fight with some mainstream candidate, probably with the leader of the Party of Social Democrats, Post-Communist Party. But he failed miserably. His final result during first round of elections 2024 was actually quite disappointing for him, I believe. He did not manage to get to the second round.
But Simion realized that Georgescu had channeled the huge anti-systemic potential in society and tied himself very closely to him. He said that he would not run for president again, since the people had already chosen Georgescu once. He even offered his own party to be Georgescu's political platform. But many people suspected that Simion was being insincere, that he was convinced that Georgescu would not be allowed to run again, and that this policy was driven by cynicism.
So he played very humble person. He played man of the people. He also wanted kind of underline that he is just like Georgescu, so he is anti-systemic, he is not linked to this old political class. And that was a problem for quite some time for Simion, because Simion and his party, they started their political campaign as anti-systemic, but they get to the parliament already in 2020, and there were a lot of rumors for a couple of years circulating that he may be willing to cooperate with some parties, parliamentary parties, including Social Democratic Party, which may sound a little bit surprising, but if we look the program on the program of Social Democrats, we will see that even though they are post-communist and they are formally left party, they are also quite nationalistic, and they tend to clash from time to time with European Commission, which actually bring them closer to nationalists. So Simion was very smart. Simion was, as I said, was trying to position himself as a humble servant, basically, of the people and of Georgescu himself, knowing that Georgescu probably will not be allowed to run in the elections.
When the Constitutional Court confirmed that Georgescu would not be allowed to run, Simion reiterated that he had no intention of running. But he would soon change his mind after an intervention.
But then, just a day later, Georgescu met with George Simion, and he kind of gave his blessing. After this conversation, Simion came to the stage and said, I would like this person, I would like Georgescu to take over. That's his. He should win. Obviously, we know what you want. But since evil globalists from our government are doing everything they can to stand in the way, and they don't want to allow him this victory, then I will humbly do this. I will run in these elections. So he played it very well. I mean, from my perspective, he actually managed to use his anti-systemic vibe in order to improve his own anti-systemic outline.
He faced two main rivals in the first round. Crin Antonescu from the mainstream parties failed to make it through to the runoff. His opponent there would be another opposition candidate, the mayor of Bucharest, Nicușor Dan,
who was trying to position himself as maybe not anti-systemic, but definitely anti-mainstream candidate, a candidate who was very much willing to fight with those old mainstream parties, but at the same time who was obviously pro-European, who was obviously pro-NATO, who was obviously pro-Ukrainian. That's another difference between George Simion and him, because George Simion and Kalin Georgescu were, rather anti-Ukrainian, anti-Zelensky, definitely. On the other hand, of course, Nicușor Dan was simply repeating this idea that we need to support Ukraine because stability and security of Ukraine and a victory of Ukraine in this war means also victory and security for Romania.
The campaign ahead of the runoff saw only one face-to-face debate between the two candidates. It lasted over 4 hours and produced a clear winner.
And it didn't really play well for Simion. Simion, who is good speaker, definitely better speaker than Nicușor Dan. Simion is a very charismatic person with a very strong voice. He can feel the crowd and he know more or less what crowds want. While Nicușor Dan, by profession, is a mathematician. He's rather quiet. He got obvious problem with reading the crowd, with reading its emotions. There are actually rumors circulating that he can be autistic, which kind of explains also this. But it was a problem for a couple of, for first 2 hours, Simion looked definitely better. He looked more energetic. He was able to kind of, induce emotions of the crowd. But then he probably get a little bit tired, and from the factual perspective, he was obviously weaker. And Nicușor Dan was able to point out inconsistencies in Simion program, particularly when it comes to economical issues, which ended up in a situation where Simion looked a little bit too emotional and maybe not fully professional, and Nicușor Dan, well, at least he seemed to know what he was talking about, and he knew what the problems the country facing were, and also he was able to undermine reforms proposed by George Simion.
After that, Simion chose to avoid Dan
George Simion nu este aici.
and campaigned outside Romania. Wanting to show he's not isolated, he met right-wing politicians from across Europe, stressing that he participates in a pan-European union of conservatives. This choice of campaign was partially successful, but also saw Simion make mistakes.
Simion went to a TV channel actually linked to right-wing political forces in France. So obviously one could expect that he would feel good there, and the questions which he will receive will be quite soft and in line with his own views. But there were two problems. First of all was that, he decided at some point to speak French, which is not the language he commands. And it became really hilarious at some point. He was mixing French and Romanian and English, which became a source of many, many different memes.
Nous voulons o încetare a focului, un armistițiu.
C'est un cessez-le-feu, un armistice.
But that wasn't probably the largest issue. Another issue was that he was very critical towards President Macron, toward French authorities, which probably would fly in normal circumstances, but at some point this criticism kind of turned from Macron himself to France as a country, and that was a little bit too much. He was comparing France to Iran, for example, at some point, which is not a thing you can do in France without any consequences. So he was attacked even by people who are in general in line with him ideologically.
Franța s-a implicat în
Alors, la France.
din România.
Si vous traitez déjà vos homologues de dictateurs, ça promet pour les relations internationales entre la Roumanie et la France.
Back in Romania, the reaction to this was that his behaviour was non-presidential. What's more, because he was abroad, he was not participating in the domestic campaign, and the debates continued in his absence.
They were quite peculiar because there was only one person taking part in those debates, vis-a-vis a journalist or another host, and it was Nicușor Dan. So basically Nicușor Dan was still attending this kind of meetings, be it classical debates organized by TV stations or some smaller one organized by quite popular Romanian YouTubers. Sometimes I think that his personal record was like 3 debates a day, and which helped him to build recognizability and visibility across Romania. For Nicușor Dan, the largest problem was that he was mostly Bucharest politician. As a mayor of Bucharest, he was well known in Bucharest, for better and worse. Of course, there's also a lot of criticism when it comes to how he ran the city. But he had to get to the people also in different regions of Romania, particularly in the smaller towns and villages.
With only 2 weeks between the first round and the runoff, there was too little time for a whistle-stop tour of the country, so Dan opted to focus on the debates. And these had become much easier due to the absence of his opponent.
Yes, some journalists were asking him tough questions, but it's totally different situation when you have a chance to simply answer a question of your host and not being attacked politically or verbally by your main counter candidate. And another thing which helped Nicușor Dan here is that, well, when Dan and Simion were standing right next to each other, you could see this charisma difference. Without Simion during those debates, as a kind of contrast for Dan, Dan simply looked better.
All this helped Dan win the election, ending the crisis that had begun nearly 6 months earlier. With a moderate president, it would be possible to reconstruct a government composed of mainstream parties.
It took some time, it took around a month, but in the end of the day, new coalition was established, kind of new-old coalition was established. It comprised Social Democrats, so those post-communists, Party of National Liberals, Central Right Party, also Party of Save Romania Union, so USR Party, a party which used to be, which was created by Nicușor Dan, but Nicușor Dan then left this party at some point, but basically it's also kind of a liberal central right party, and UDMR, which is Democratic Union of Hungarians in Romania. It's a relatively small party representing Hungarian minority, which quite often participates in ruling coalitions. Yeah, so after a month, coalition which encompasses all those parties, was established, and Prime Minister Ilie Bolojan, leader of National Liberal Party, was voted Prime Minister.
With a settled ruling coalition in place, the next parliamentary election not for another 3 years, and the presidential crisis over, it would be natural to think that Romania no longer faces political problems.
I would say that Romanian problems or mainstream political class, or rather liberal political class problem just started. Why? Well, mostly because this newly re-established political elite needs now to tackle problems which were kind of piling up for quite some time already and which were not really handled at all because of this political and electoral turmoil. And the most important thing is finance. Public deficit is reaching historical heights. It's enough to say that in 2019, public debt of Romania was relatively low. It was around 35% in comparison to the GDP, which was very good result, particularly if we will think about different countries in the European Union. It rose significantly, but still it wasn't too much during COVID times for obvious reasons. Many countries increased their debt during COVID times in order to pay some compensation for companies and so on and so forth, and to finance all those emergency programs which had to be introduced because of that. And now this public debt to GDP ratio stands at around 55%. We're talking about 2024, 2025. Probably in this year it will be even more. Maybe it will reach around 60% in 2025 or 2026. So it kind of doubled in comparison to 2019.
What's more, Romania has been in the EU's excessive deficit procedure since 2020. This is triggered when a country's yearly deficit to GDP ratio is over 3%. In 2024 in Romania, this was over 9%. And this mechanism carries grave consequences.
Being in extensive deficit procedure for over 5 years means that at some point country can lost access to European money. And Romania basically was on verge of losing European funds, starting from National Reconstruction Program, the program initiated after COVID-20 pandemic.
In response to this threat, the new government was quick to introduce fiscal reforms. Alongside the limits on public spending, they have passed a rise in VAT from 19 to 21%. There is also a rise in excise affecting fuel, alcohol and tobacco, and a tax on banks' revenue. When introducing an austerity drive, it's typical for those in power to blame their predecessors, but this is not an option for the current government.
Current coalition, and being the mainstream and systemic coalition, gathering mostly parties which were in power for the last 30 years, cannot say it's not our fault. We are new government, we are new political forces, we need to kind of handle problems created by our predecessors. No, basically the same parties which are now trying to do something with budget deficit are also responsible for this budget deficit to happen in the first place.
And this policy is sure to have an impact on the government's popularity.
What is happening right now in Romania is very good, or can serve as a very good propaganda political fuel for opposition, and will decrease already low trust and popularity and support for the mainstream political parties. If you will look on the opinion polls, you will see that right after tax reform was put on the table and people understood what kind of changes will be introduced, support for George Simion party rose to historical high.
So perhaps this is not the end of Romania's crisis, but just a pause before the next one. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, why not try the one you can see on screen now?